Hello, my friends, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor. Now, today we're going to be talking about Kull, Exile of Atlantis. Kull was the creation of Robert E. Howard. I've been meaning to get back to Robert E. Howard. I did a video when I first started the channel. I did a video about Robert E. Howard. Robert E. Howard is one of my favorite writers of all time. And so I've been meaning to talk about some of his work in more detail. And so we're going to start with Kull. And I got to thinking about Kull the other day when this big guy came in the mail. That is Kull right there. This is a comic book collection. Marvel Comics struck gold with Conan in the 1970s. So they went and started looking at some of his other great creations. Kull was one of his greatest creations, so they decided to make some comics about Kull. And this book has a ton of the comics. A lot of these comics, or all of these comics in this volume, were the black and white comic books that came out in magazine format back in the 70s and 80s. But this big book coming in the mail, it made me think about Kull. And it made me think about, it's about time I go back to talking about Robert E. Howard and Kull, because Kull is actually a very important character. Kull and the Kull stories are more important than you might think, especially if you like fantasy. And fantasy, as you know, seems to be pretty huge right now on the booktube. Everybody on the booktube loves fantasy, it seems like, which is cool. I'm right on board with you guys. I like fantasy too. But Kull is really important for fantasy. Kull was one of Robert E. Howard's earlier creations. He preceded Conan. A lot of people kind of consider him to be a prototype Conan. There's truth to that, but it's also a little bit more complicated than that as well. When I was looking through this book, there are some introductions by some of the comic book creators and writers who did these comics, and a couple of them said straight away what I've heard very often, which is that they preferred the Kull stories to the Conan stories. I've heard a lot of that. Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft, who was a pen pal and long-distance friend to Robert E. Howard. They wrote each other all the time. And Lovecraft was a big fan of Robert E. Howard's work. But he definitely preferred the Kull stories to the Conan stories that came later. And there was a reason for that, I think. The Kull stories, they're more on a world that is a straight fantasy world. They're not as proto-history as the Conan's world was, the Hyborian Age. The Kull stories definitely feel like a lost world. The Kull stories are from the pre-cataclysmic age, which come before the Hyborian Age of Conan. They are mentioned. That age was mentioned in the Conan series, and in the essay "The Hyborian Age," which Robert E. Howard wrote about about Conan's world. He mentions Kull's world, because Kull was the ancient history to the Hyborian Age. So these stories took place a long, long time ago, before the great cataclysm which sank Atlantis and changed the shape of the earth and the continents. So Kull was from Atlantis, the lost continent. But unlike the continent that we kind of think of, we always think of Atlantis as being kind of this advanced place, a place of advanced thinking and maybe even advanced science. Everybody has different ideas about what Atlantis might have been. It wasn't real anyway. But we all have our ideas about what it could have been. And Robert E. Howard's Atlantis is kind of a savage place. And Kull were kind of he was a barbarian because there were barbarians on Atlantis, and he was part of a barbarian tribe. Now he is the exile of Atlantis from the title here. This is the Ballantine Books edition of Kull. And he was the exile of Atlantis because he was driven, or he had to run from his tribe because he showed mercy. A woman was going to be burned to death. She was on the stake and she was going to be burned to death for having the temerity of falling in love with an enemy. So his tribe was going to burn this woman to death, and Kull slew her before she could be put to the flames, so that she would not feel the pain. It was a mercy. It was a mercy. She kind of wanted him to do that, so that she would not suffer. And so he was driven from the tribe. He literally had to do that and run from his tribe. So he journeyed to across to the continent and the kingdom of Valusia, which was the greatest kingdom of that age, the pre-cataclysmic age. And eventually, by his own hand, he made himself king of Valusia. Now that part might sound a bit familiar because that is indeed what Conan did. Conan became a king by his own hand. And so a lot of the Kull stories did in fact influence Conan quite a bit. In fact, the first Conan story was a rewritten Kull story that didn't sell. These were all pulp stories that Robert E. Howard was trying to sell to Weird Tales. Only 3 stories were published from the Kull series. He wrote a few of them, and all of them are in this slim little book. So there were not many Kull stories. And all of them were published in Weird Tales, the 3 that were published. The most important being the Shadow Kingdom. The Shadow Kingdom, which is the second story in this book. This book is fantastic because it's illustrated by Justin Sweet. It is Justin, right? Yeah, Justin Sweet illustrates this book, and his illustrations are amazing. This is definitely the edition to get. There were a couple paperbacks editions of King Kull that came before this, but this is the one to get your hands on if you're interested in this character, if you're interested in Robert E. Howard, or just in the history of fantasy. Because the Shadow Kingdom is one of the most important fantasy stories ever published. If there were ever to be a definitive history and an accurate history of fantasy fiction, the Shadow Kingdom should be a major part of that history, because the Shadow Kingdom was the very first sword and sorcery story. It was the story that combined all the elements that you need to have a sword and sorcery story into one story. So the Shadow Kingdom is very important. It was published in 1929. So Robert E. Howard, even more than people think, is a foundational figure in fantasy. Not just for his Conan stories, but for his Kull stories. Kull was a very different character than Conan. Conan was a pretty complex character, more complex than most people think. I personally think that the Conan stories that Robert E. Howard wrote were the best stories that Robert E. Howard ever did. Everything clicked, I think, in the Conan stories, including Conan himself. A tremendous saga, the Conan stories. If you haven't read them, you should read them. But Kull, I can see why some people prefer him. He's a deeper thinker than Conan was. I don't think he was more intelligent than Conan. I think Conan was kind of savagely smart and clever. But I think Kull was more of a brooder. Kull had some interesting personality traits. He was a big, savage, tough barbarian who would go berserk when he was fighting and just slaughter everybody around him. Big, strong, massive guy who you did not want to mess with, this guy. But he was also a deep thinker. He was a brooder. He had dark moods. Didn't seem to be interested in women at all, which was entirely different than Conan. Conan was like the opposite of that. Kull didn't seem to have any romantic interests at all. It was a peculiar part of his personality. He did not know women and was not interested in them very much, it seems. I think that part was just part of Robert E. Howard kind of projecting his own life into his characters, which he did. One of the reasons Robert E. Howard's writing is so powerful is because he really did, as H.P. Lovecraft said, he put himself in everything he wrote. He would put himself almost in a writing trance, and he would pour everything he had into his stories. And you get that. When you read this guy's stories, you're there in his stories. And I think he put a lot of himself into his characters. And while Conan was kind of a wish fulfillment kind of character, Conan was the kind of guy that Robert E. Howard wanted to be. You can tell. Kull was more like the kind of guy that he was. There's a lot more Robert E. Howard in Kull than Conan, I think. Robert E. Howard lived a pretty lonely life. He had a girlfriend at one point who famously wrote a book about their relationship, which became a movie, The Whole Wide World. But other than that, he did not have a lot of contact with women. He was sort of a brooder himself. He was kind of a loner. He lived in a small town of Cross Plains where he was kind of the weirdo. He was kind of the man apart who made more money than a lot of people in the town by writing his stories, actually. But still, a lot of people didn't feel like he had a real job. He was that kind of weird guy, Robert. And he did not have a lot of experience with women. He died young. He died when he was 30. And he probably died a virgin, probably. And so he puts a lot of himself in Kull. And that's one of the things that makes Kull so interesting. The Shadow Kingdom, the story that I'm talking about, is an incredible story. It's beautifully written, for the one thing. That's the first thing you're going to notice, when you read it. It's just how well it's written, which for an early story by Robert E. Howard is pretty interesting. This guy was a talented writer. Probably no one's choice for best writer in the world, but he could put you where he wanted to put you. He can put you in his world. And the reason he could do that is because he was there himself. And in this story, Kull, the king of Valusia, teams up with Brule, the spear slayer, a Pict, who was a great friend to have, Brule the spear slayer. Now they're tribes who are enemies, so they start off kind of hostile to each other. But they do team up to fight the evil serpent men who can take the form of anyone they wish. It's interesting story. The idea of the serpent men who can take the form of human beings is an idea that has outlived the story, definitely. But the story itself is incredible, The Shadow Kingdom. Probably the best of the Kull stories. In fact, it is definitely the best of the Kull stories. Some people prefer some other ones. All the stories that he wrote, and like I said, a lot of the stories that he wrote about Kull were not published. They were rejected by Weird Tales, the ones that he submitted, except for 3. And one of those was another team-up story, Kings of the Night, or Kings in the Night. I can't remember. Let me see. Kings of the Night, where Kull is transported to the future, where he teams up with Bran MacMorn, another great Robert E. Howard character that I will talk about on another time. But reading these stories, they do vary in quality. Nothing that he wrote other than The Shadow Kingdom quite lived up to that story, but they all are interesting, and they all have are well worth reading, and there's not that many of them. And you do get a sense of this strange, shadowy, magical, lost world. The sense of place in these stories is brilliant, and it definitely seems like a more shadowy, more mysterious place than Conan's Hyborian Age, which comes later. The Hyborian Age was probably better for the kind of action-packed sword and sorcery stories that Howard became the best at writing. And to my mind, again, like I said, nothing touches Conan, but Kull was pretty great. And I really highly recommend you guys check out this book. If you're interested, like I said, in fantasy at all, this was foundational. There are certain foundational figures in fantasy, like Lord Dunsany, and definitely Robert E. Howard, that you really need, if you're interested in that genre, you really need to check them out. So, Kull, Exile of Atlantis. Hope you have a chance to read it. Okay, guys, thanks for stopping by Stately Vaughn Manor once again. Tune in tomorrow for your Sunday Penguin. Okay, guys, take care.